This is very, it's just sculpturally looking at it, it's very engaging. It's like, wow.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. Would we be able to look at it in conjunction with
Oh,
the
sure,
other
yeah.
one?
I've
Can
got
I
the
just
other
hold
one.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah, again, I found these a fascinating pair to look at in the store because they are very much sort of African objects, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
They come from Nigeria and the Niger Delta, so all the sort of little estuaries and the swampy area of southern Nigeria. And yeah, they're fascinating. They're quite, I don't know, got quite an aggressive, quite a scary stance to them.
Yeah.
And they're obviously kind of warrior. I mean, the peoples from whom they were made were quite sort of warrior-like,
Mm-hmm.
and which is quite interesting in itself because those were the sort of areas of Africa where slave raids would have been quite common, and the little estuaries was where sort of slaving cargo would have travelled down on its way down to the coast to meet the slave trading ships. And it's also just interesting to think about the context in which so many people were transported through West Africa to be put on board the ships, because British slave traders didn't set foot on past the beaches, and so in order for that many people to be transported, it required a huge amount of sort of manpower, and sort of slave raids and kidnapping was common, and so I guess societies became warlike, either defending their own peoples or as part of this kind of system of obtaining humans. And I think what's interesting about these is what they're holding, because although they're very African in style, they're holding imported goods. So here we see a gun and a knife, and here we see a distinctive gin bottle, a square gin bottle. So these were imported goods. They wouldn't have been produced in Africa, and they would have been quite prestigious and important. And gin wasn't actually used for drinking; it was used for making libations. So it had a religious significance. So here we have a religious significance, and then here we've got the gun, which was obviously used for defence and in warfare. So these are objects that would have been traded, and although we've got to be a bit careful, because again the dates of these objects are quite late. They relate to the 19th century, the late 19th century, I think, possibly early 20th. So these aren't sort of 17th or early 18th century, but it's just very interesting because leading on from the other traded goods that we've seen, these show you yet another example of the goods that were traded with African merchants and became integral to African society. And today, you go to Ghana, and alcohol's got important roles in libations and ritual significance. So,
and I think the subtlety of this, I mean, if you were to, depending on how it was displayed, it's artistic or it's cultural or it's a lot of different things. And I'll admit that when I first saw it, I didn't pick up on the subtlety of what these people were actually holding. And then when you actually read into that, it just becomes so much more interesting. At first, it's an artistic object. I can kind of guess at maybe how it was used or where it came from, but that's just, it's the perfect visual example of the influence we were having and they were having on us, the way that the cultures crossed.
Yeah. And actually, that reminds me, a final twist to the story is that I think these are described in the accession register as being shrine objects, so they would have been placed onto the shrines and as sort of reliquary guardian figures. But interestingly, curator from Liverpool Museum came in and he said, I really don't think those are what they're supposed to be, because if they were sitting on somebody's tomb or somebody's grave, then with the humid climate in Africa, they would have likely to have insects kind of biting away at the bottoms, and they would have been in decay. And as you can see, there's no sign of wear or any sign that it's been outside. So his interpretation, and something that I've got increasingly interested in, is the fact that were these made for indigenous use, if you like, or were they made to be traded back to Westerners and Europeans that came to Africa wanting to collect authentic African objects. So is there sort of like a double kind of edged sword, isn't it? Were these actually, if you like, tourist objects made to sell to Westerners? And in fact, that's how we got it at the Manchester Museum. it's come in via Mr. and Mrs. Baker. So it was collected by Europeans, and it's come to the museum. So were they, are they tourist objects, if you like? And if so, it's interesting that they're showing, imported goods.
And it's also like neat that there's this dialogue going on with other curators, and that people can put in their different ideas and interpretations, because until that point, that would completely affect how an object like this would be displayed and interpreted to the public.
Definitely.
And all it takes is another person's perspective to say, wait a minute, this, our expertise isn't infinite. It's not like the last. Yeah. And even if you were to show this, taking objects back to the people or where they came from, or, being re-examined in that way, you might have a different view on it again.
Yeah.
So,
it's all about, I suppose, getting as many different perspectives on them as possible, because every time it's a fresh pair of eyes sees them, or somebody with a different background, and people can read different things out of them, and it's almost endless, kind of the different meanings these sort of objects can have. So,
and again, like, unless someone is doing a PhD like you, or a project like this comes about, these things will just sit in the collections, and they may, get catalogued again or taken out, checked or something, but you won't have the opportunity to have that reevaluation. So, do we know anything about Mr. and Mrs. Baker, or is it again kind of one of the, just the names and the date? That's all we have when it comes to.
I can't actually remember for these. I'd have to look at the documentation again, but there are some very similar objects that came in via a administrator that was working out in Nigeria, and I can't remember whether these are actually from him, but they may well be. But he was working in Nigeria, and he brought back a series of carved objects. But he was there very much embedded within the colonial context that he was working as an administrator for a period of about 15, 20 years in the 1940s. So it's quite a lot of, and that's about the time when there was this whole debate about African art and art objects and authentic African objects. So it may well have been within that context that these sort of objects were being produced as authentic African art objects. And they're definitely art objects to me, but whether they're the art objects in the way that Europeans thought they were, as in authentic grave figures. But